Hi, this is Charles, and this is another study in the Journey Through God's Word Bible Study series. On this study, we'll be looking at the topic of faith. And if you enjoy the study, please like, subscribe, and share, and hit the notification bell so you're informed whenever I post additional videos. Thank you. Verse 1 of Hebrews chapter 11, the Apostle Paul presents what is arguably the most succinct definition of faith in the whole Bible. That definition contains two terms that are key to understanding what faith is. Those terms are substance and evidence. What is substance? The Oxford Languages Dictionary describes that as the real physical matter of which a person or thing consists and which has a tangible, solid presence. What is evidence? The term evidence is defined as that which tends to prove or disprove something. The term is often applied in a legal or law enforcement context, with evidence being used to prove what happened, how it happened, and when and where it happened, and who did it. There are usually two types of evidence available. The first is the testimony of eyewitnesses. This is what you see in many courtroom dramas or plays or movies. The second type of evidence is a tangible object, something that can be seen, felt, heard, smelled, or otherwise sensed, or a physical indication of the existence of such an object, such as a fingerprint, a footprint, an impression, an indentation, or something like that. And these are presented in place of eyewitness evidence or in addition to. Faith in the Bible, and especially in the New Testament, we see that Jesus was always trying to get his disciples to understand the power of faith and faithfulness. More often than not, he was disappointed by their lack of faith. One such incident occurred after Jesus had finished ministering. He and the 12 disciples entered into a boat and started to cross the Sea of Galilee. Jesus went to the back of the boat and laid down to take a nap. The full story is told in Mark 4, verse 37 through 40. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" Afterward, instead of using Jesus' rebuke as a motivation to increase their own faith, the disciples used it as an occasion to give themselves an excuse for not exercising the faith that they already had been given. Quote, they were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." Mark 4 and 41. By asking who and what kind of man that Jesus was to be able to speak to the wind and the waves, the disciples were implying that only someone like him, someone like the Son of God, could do the things that he did. They wanted to attribute his successes to some great and mysterious gift that God had given only to his Son, but not something that he, God, had given to everyone. Because they weren't God's begotten sons, they couldn't be expected to do the things that God's begotten Son had done. Another important biblical example of the working of faith is the story of young David's encounter with the Philistine giant Goliath. This story is told in 1 Samuel chapter 17. It begins with the Philistine army and the Israelite army facing each other across a great plain. Each morning, for 40 consecutive days, Goliath, the Philistine giant, strode out onto the plain and challenged the Israelites to send out a champion to fight him in individual combat, with the winner securing victory for his army and his nation. And each day, Goliath's challenge went unanswered. But on the 40th day, young David, who was probably about 17 years old at the time, came into the Israelite camp, bringing food and supplies for three of his brothers who were serving in the Israelite army. He arrived just in time to hear Goliath's challenge for that day. Enraged by what he heard, he decided to take up the challenge and face the giant himself. When Israelite King Saul heard that David wanted to fight the giant, he called the young man to him and tried to dissuade him. But when David would not be discouraged, Saul gave him his own armor and sword. However, not being familiar with either wearing armor or using a sword, David turned them down. Like most people, David trusted in and depended on the things with which he was most familiar. As a shepherd, he had often used his shepherd's staff and his sling to protect the sheep under his care. He trusted that those tools could be enough in his current situation, so he collected 5 smooth stones and placed them in his bag, knowing that such stones would fly straight and true towards whatever target he chose. Then, with sling in hand, he confidently strode out onto the plain to announce that he was accepting Goliath's challenge. After sparring verbally with the giant, David loaded a stone into the sling and let it fly. It struck Goliath in the forehead, breaking the bones of his skull and sinking into his brain. The giant fell to the ground. David quickly ran toward the fallen giant, removed the giant's own sword, and used it to remove his head. The battle was over, and David had won. In this story, we can see that David's faith was not in the best armor that money could buy. His level of faith was that he could destroy Goliath with 5 smooth stones. But God's faithfulness was that Goliath's death was not predicated on David's stones, but on his belief. If David had believed that he could destroy Goliath with a sheet of paper, and he didn't doubt, then God would have given him a way to do the thing that he believed and kill a giant with just a piece of paper. Jesus himself illustrated this truth when he fed 5,000 men and their families with just 2 small fish and 5 loaves of barley bread. When Jesus had told the disciples to feed the people, they had complained about how much money it would take to buy enough food to feed so many, showing that their faith was in material things like money. Jesus responded to their concerns by asking them how much bread they already had. They went away to find the answer and came back saying that they had found a young boy with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Jesus then told the disciples to have the people sit down on the grass in groups. Then he took the fish and the bread and blessed them and gave them to the disciples to hand out to the people. After everyone had eaten their fill, Jesus had the disciples go back through the crowd and collect up all the uneaten scraps of food that were left. Altogether, they collected 12 baskets full of the scraps. That's Mark 6:33 through 40. Here we can see Paul's definition of faith in action. Jesus' faith gave substance to enough food to feed as many as needed to be fed. And the 12 baskets full of scraps was the evidence that even though they could not see it before it was physically manifested, everything that was needed was already there in God's riches and glory. Faith then gives us the ability to see with our spiritual eyes what our physical eyes cannot. For we walk by faith and not by sight. Our natural eyes see what's tangible, but our faith sees what is spiritually possible and brings it into the natural. We see many examples of this throughout Scripture. For example, Moses' staff. His eyes saw only a piece of wood, but his faith saw the tool that God had given him to be able to perform miracles, like parting the Red Sea or bringing water out of a rock. Or Shamgar, one of the judges who ruled Israel before their first king. He saw a pointy wooden stick that was used to direct and guide goats and sheep as a weapon that he could use to defeat 500 of Israel's enemies single-handedly. Gideon and his 300. They used simple ram's horns, clay pots, and torches as tools to defeat a much larger Midianite army without having to even shed a drop of blood themselves. And mighty Samson, when he found himself surrounded by a large Philistine army, looked down and saw not the dried jawbone of a dead donkey, but a weapon that he used to kill 1,000 of his enemies. During a great famine in the land, the prophet Elijah went to the home of a widow in the town of Zarephath and asked her to make him a loaf of bread so that he'd have something to eat. She responded that she only had a small bit of oil in a jar and a little bit of flour left in a bowl, and she was about to make a last meal for herself and her son, and then they would die. But Elijah saw more in the oil and the flour than a single last meal for a widow and her son. He told her that if she used it to make him something to eat, that God would take care of her and her son. She obliged, and for the rest of the famine, the small bit of oil that she had left and the small bit of flour never ran out, and they were able to survive until the rains came again. Elisha, like Elijah before him, also had an encounter with a widow and a small jar full of oil. In this case, the widow was in the town of Shunem, and she was the widow of a prophet in training under Elisha himself. He had died owing money to debtors who had come to the widow's house and told her that if she couldn't pay the debts, that they would take her 2 sons to work it off. They would make her sons slaves for them until the debt was paid. Not wanting to see her sons taken as slaves, she went to Elisha and asked him for help. Elisha then turned to her and asked her, "What do you have in your house?" She replied that all she had was a bottle of oil. Elisha then saw the bottle of oil as not just a single bottle of oil, but as the solution to all her problems. He instructed her to go to all of her neighbors and collect up as many large jars as she could and bring them into the house. He specifically told her not to collect only a few jars, but to collect many. The widow and her sons then got busy collecting jars and bringing them into the house. When they had collected what they thought were enough, Elisha told them to close the door and then start pouring the oil from the jar into the pots. As they poured, each of the jars in turn were filled, but the oil kept flowing until every jar had been filled. Once they were finished, Elisha told them, "Now sell the oil and use the money to pay off your debts. And any money that's left, you can live on for the rest of your lives." And there was Elijah's mantle, which he passed on to Elisha when he was taken up to heaven in the fiery chariot. It was nothing more than a piece of cloth to the natural eyes, but in the hands of the 2 prophets, it became something much more. Both of them, in fact, used that mantle to part the waters of the Jordan River so that they could walk past on dry ground. Finally, there were David's 5 smooth stones, one of which we already have seen killed a Philistine giant and saved a nation.